I'd like to introduce a young man who I met when he was 16, when he came with a group of American Chestertonians some years ago. Was that 2004? 2004. He was a 16-year-old young man on fire with the Holy Spirit, really. His father and himself had just converted from the Lutherans. He joined his father and became a Catholic, and here he is now, Father Spencer Howe. He's going to talk to us. He's a Roman Catholic priest of the archdiocese of St. Paul and Minneapolis, USA. He says one of the most joyful days of his life was his priestly ordination on May the 25th, 2013. So it's very recent. His formation and preparation took place in Rome at the North American College. In 2012, he completed his STP at the Gregorian University. This year, he's completing his final year of his STL, specializing in church history at the Pontifical Lateran University. And he's completing his thesis on Chesterton's conversion and reception in Italy. Raised as an evangelical Lutheran, Father Howe became a Catholic on December the 13th, 2001, and has never looked back. Each on their own path, his parents and sister were likewise all received into the church. He says Chesterton has been a constant companion and spiritual mentor for his entire family. So if you'd put your hands together, please, for young Spencer Howe.
Thank you. It's indeed humbling to be back after 10 years. I'm now 27 years old. Something of Dale's experience walking into the room and realizing how much younger he was, and yet I'm used to being the youngest, so it's not new for me. Certainly on both sides of my family, I was the youngest among the cousins. But when I first came, I was even 10 years younger than I am now. It's a striking thing for me to think about. 16 years old, I turned 17 while I was here in England. But I remembered well, because I learned then how to order a pint, because one gets thirsty on pilgrimage. My parents were delighted when I returned that I also learned how to keep a cigar lit. But I have people like Martin and Dale to thank, because indeed I was taught by Christian men. But that wasn't all I learned. There were profound lessons on that pilgrimage, and on our pilgrim trail, we certainly saw ourselves as the companions on their way to Canterbury, which we did visit. But I was discipled during those days. I was discipled. As I look back, things came to heart, things came to mind. Priesthood. Who would ever think that there was a vocation director among us on that trip? There were a few priests along the way. And those long coach trips across England, we stayed in Luton, and we went from Luton to visit some of the great ruined abbeys and some of the living hearts of Catholicism. Walsingham, we made a pilgrimage. We did the last mile of the Slipper Chapel barefoot. Who would have ever thought that priesthood would then begin in my young heart and mind to open me up to a whole world? The Mass, we had daily Mass along our way. We climbed into a priest's hole. I very distinctly remember that experience. We tasted, we felt the suffering of those who kept the faith alive. I remember the rosaries along our coach trip. I remember Walsingham. I remember Chesterton's living witness of faith in the way that he showed through his apostolate of the pen that the faith was worth fighting for. I say that my faith came alive to me during those days, but really it would be more exact to say that I came alive to the faith, because the faith was never dead. I specialized especially learning the stories of the English martyrs, that there was a cost to be freely paid. And that cost had been freely paid by men and women who had come before, who died to keep faith alive, to transmit faith generation to generation here in England, but also in my homeland. It would not be exaggerated to say that the course of my life was changed during those August days, those hot August days. But I'm back to where I began 10 years later, to the place of encounter, a turning point out of myself into a call to deeper conversion. I'd become a Catholic just a few years before. But as I ponder back, and I sometimes say, did Chesterton bring me to Catholicism? Maybe not. I had discovered Catholicism just a few years before I ever read Chesterton. And yet I say that sometimes I think that Chesterton kept me from being a fallen away Catholic, one who just drifted away and somehow lost that initial spark, somehow forgot everything that he'd discovered. That's the beautiful thing about a convert, one that sees with new eyes what he didn't have to begin with. Meanwhile, these 5 years later of study in Minnesota and 5 years later in Rome, I've gone much deeper into word and sacrament. Every day of my life has been the Mass, has been time in the chapel. I was ordained a deacon at St. Peter's last year. I was ordained a priest back home in Minnesota. There have been many holy hours of listening to the Lord in prayer, quiet. There have been spiritual lessons, deepening self-knowledge. Along with that, certainly the community life, the joy of fraternity that I've discovered in seminary life. But as anybody, certainly those of us that have spent time in seminary, the challenges, the need for persistence, the opportunities to be humbled. And of course, I'm just at the very, very beginning, an infant priest. This summer, I was a baby priest. I've progressed. I've progressed. Of course, the study of philosophy, theology, history, a new language, Italian, which has opened a whole new world, and delighted that I was able to bring Marco Sammarini, president of the Italian Chesterton Society, to speak with us. But indeed, it has been a beautiful period of my life. These 10 years, really the bookends, that visit in 2004 and this visit now, as I come to bring my formation to a conclusion and to embark on the life of priestly service in my diocese. It's a humbling thing. But I acknowledge, indeed, that my conversion is far from complete, that there's a long path ahead, along a path of perseverance. But as I was pondering being young, which again I'm not apologetic for, I recognized that passage fulfilled in me, that Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and years, and in favor with God and men. It's a humbling thing to look at one's own young life and to say, I've been walking that path by the grace of God, by the gift of my family, by the discovery of my faith, by the encouragement and support of so many, among them Martin and Dale. But the young have a part to play, and this is what I want to say today, because there are young people here. Not everyone's going to be able to speak. There are young people not able to be with us. I'm in a seminary of 250 men, full. There's no space to put the seminarians. Even the seminary back in our diocese is full. Prayers are being answered to raise up a generation, continue to support the work of the preaching of the gospel. But the young have a part to play, and St. Paul's words to Timothy are ringing in my ears. Let no one disregard you because you're young, but be an example to all the believers in the way you speak and behave, in your love, in your faith, in your piety. Of course, I am a young man, but I want to bear witness to Chesterton's importance in my life, my path to the priesthood, which really began 10 years ago here in England, to discover men that became priests knowing that they would die, And indeed, I became a priest with that same sense, that my life would have to be a gift, would have to be an offering, would have to be a pouring out, because it is the nature of love to bind itself. As Chesterton reminds us, the nature of love is to bind itself. He talks about the rashness of a vow, the rashness of a marriage vow, the rashness of a religious vow, the rashness of saying, present, I long to do the Father's will. Here I am when my name was called at St. Peter's and in the cathedral in St. Paul, to stand and say present. Indeed, I was young. I am young. 15 when I became a Catholic, ordained a priest at 26. And yet, men have done noble and great things. Just look at the names among the English martyrs. They've done noble and great things at 21, even at 18 and 16. I was pondering the war memorial there in Beaconsfield, just down the road, and thinking about those names, both the First World War and the Second World War. Those were young men that laid down their lives, not out of hatred for what was out there, but of love for what was behind them. The great truth about the soldier is he fights because he loves. He loves his home. He loves his land. It's true for the priest as well. As I bear witness to Chesterton's importance, I want to speak as well for a moment about the morale of my generation, which is in crisis. Among the ranks of my own generation, not to mention the subsequent ones, those that have grown up saturated in a technological age, disillusioned with political life, disillusioned in the truth and the meaning of patriotism, with faded hopes, despairing, fragmentation in relationships, broken families, wounds, confusion, profound ignorance of faith, truth, God's love, the last things, heaven and hell, judgment, and the profound hope that we have for beatitude, our call to happiness forever with God. Ours and mine is not so much an age of rebellion, because my generation is weary of rebelling. It's no longer an age of revolt. And Chesterton knew very much about young people. He was a young man once, and we like to believe that he remained one at heart. But he spoke in a beautiful essay in The Well in the Shallows, some lines that I'll share. Towards the ends of his life, he wrote, "The great danger of the moment is that young men will go on being content with these revolts against revolts, these reactions against reactions, so that we have nothing but an everlasting seesaw of the old young and the young young, the last always content with its fleeting triumph over the last but one. And the only way to avoid that result is to teach men to stretch their minds and to inhabit a larger period of time, to insist that there really does exist somewhere a reasonable plan of the proportion of things, which at least in its general outline is true all the time." This isn't just the conventional truth. This isn't just what's in vogue now. This is the democracy of the dead. This is allowing our forebears to have their vote. This is about living the faith which is ever ancient and ever new. For an age that's wearied with revolution and revolt, the church, the faith, is the proposal that must be made. It's the proposal that was made to me by men and women who believed enough to think the faith something worth sharing with me. And I hope to be a priest of that same ilk, to be a priest that believes in such a way that he hopes and that he helps young people to come to believe, old people to continue to believe, to stay the path of faith. Because as he also says in The Thing, one of the most profound lines of Chesterton, profoundly true, it reads as clearly as the Catechism: "All human beings, without exception whatever, were specially made and shaped like pointed arrows for the end of hitting the mark of beatitude, eternal life with God." We need to go out on the mission like Innocent Smith, wholly alive, to persuade, to offer that profound truth that we're made for happiness. We're made for happiness. I find Innocent Smith in that beautiful story, Man Alive, is almost a precursor to the new evangelization, the call that's been given over and over again. As Innocent Smith set out to shock people into a realization of how good it was to be alive, and that until we were dead, we would be alive, fully alive in Christ. Certainly these are lessons that I discovered here in England, thanks to those English martyrs, those men who laid down their lives, thanks to Dale and to Martin, the priests that were along on our trip. And really what I discovered leaving England is that there was a whole band of disciples, there was a whole band of friends of Chesterton. Everywhere I've been, I've sought them out, and I've discovered probably the most eccentric bunch on the face of the earth. I think we see that here today. And yet what a great gift it is to come into contact with someone by those who love, those who know. How true that is about Christ himself. We come into contact with the Lord by meeting his disciples. It's true, and I hope you won't consider it some ways an exaggeration to say there's something very analogous that's there. We meet Chesterton through his disciples, through those who knew him, those who loved him, those who spoke about him. That's very, very close to what happens with coming to know the Lord. And of course, Chesterton, just like the disciples of the Lord, always is leading us, always making that introduction, that we would never end in him, but he would always lead us on, just as the whole communion of saints is always about. To come back again to the young experience and the experience of my generation, I want to take another line from The Well in the Shallows, one of the great books of essays from the Catholic Chesterton, the late essays. He says, "The modern mind is a forest primeval, filled with murmuring pines and hemlocks. It's the jungle. It's the thickest of all thickets and the thorniest of all earthly briar patches." He says, "I was born and bred in that briar patch, just like Briar Rabbit. But I found it difficult to find a path out of it. But in the end, Chesterton succeeded. He broke through. He broke through the jungle, and he discovered the wide open places. He uses many images to speak of Catholicism and what he discovered therein, the fullness of life he was called to, fullness of Christian life and Christian joy. One of the greatest, so present in the Catholic Church and Conversion, which has certainly been the most important book in my life. He speaks about the open place. It may be passing through a door, but what we don't realize is we're passing out of a closed space into an open one. We become citizens of the whole world. He says that I can finally say, in the words that the Roman citizens said, the words that St. Paul said, Romanus civis sum. I am not a slave because I'm a citizen of Rome. And indeed, Chesterton did escape the briar patch of worldly thinking, conventional thinking. And he succeeded with God's grace, as we will succeed with God's grace and GK's help to break through as well. Of course, there is a malformation that happens at the hands of the world. And I think that weariness that I noted, the weariness among my generation, that no longer wants to rebel, it no longer has the energy to rebel. The generation that has been characterized most by hope, that is the young generation, usually filled with hope and aspiration, is no longer, in so many places, no longer driven and propelled forward by hope. But I think we can, as believers, as believing men and women, seize on the weariness of the world, especially among the young people, and offer that proposal of orthodoxy, that proposal of orthodoxy. The first work that I read of Chesterton was not orthodoxy, it was heretics. And I realized quickly that I didn't want to be one of those. They thought they were in advance of the age, but the ideas were old, tired, and stale. I took an excellent course this semester on Gnosticism, and I realized, thanks be to God, we're not Gnostics. It's mind-numbingly boring. It reads like science fiction. It's amazingly fantastical. And yet, there's nothing there because it's conventional. It's put together by men. It's a man's way of conceiving the world and cosmology and faith. No, ours is a faith that's given to us by God. We need the eternal church. We need the church that points us to the eternal things that are always and everywhere satisfying, the perennial things, the satisfying things. In the Napoleon of Notting Hill, Chesterton's great line, it's not the new things that men tire of fashions and proposals. It is of the new things that men tire, of fashions and proposals, improvements and change. It's the old things, just like wine, just like aged beer. It's the old things that startle and intoxicate. It's the old things that are young. Christ, his sacraments, clear and deep waters. The most beautiful of the images Chesterton uses is certainly the deep well in comparison to the shallows that the world offers. But I truly do admit and bear witness to this on behalf of the young people here and elsewhere, young men and women around the world that have discovered orthodoxy, that have decided to follow after Christ, recognizing, as Pope Benedict and Pope Francis continues to remind us, that Christ takes nothing away from us, but he gives us everything as we entrust ourselves to him. It's paradoxical, but one of the ways that my generation rebels is into orthodoxy. We rebel into orthodoxy. We rebel by going to church. We rebel by believing in the Christian faith. It's a striking but true thing. And as a priest, no longer just as a believer somewhere in a parish, it's a beautiful thing, that call to the laity. And that's why I want to honor in a very real way Martin and Dale and Marco and those laymen who have held up the banner and in some ways reminded us who are priests that we need to be waging a battle not just here in the church to proclaim the gospel, but one that needs to break out into the world to make that proclamation very clear and strong and unabashed. These men who live for their families, they pour out their lives for their families every day, have taught me a great lesson about priesthood. Because as a priest, I am a bearer of a tradition, a builder of bridges. I need to accompany people out of the shallows into the depths, to drink from the deep fonts, the fresh fonts, the clearest and most satisfying well there is. Baptism, the Eucharist, the forgiveness of sins. And as a convert, I did experience for the very first time in my life, at the age of 15, that truly amazing experience that Chesterton experienced, causing him to write that beautiful poem, The Convert. My name is Lazarus, and I live. I am no longer defined or bound by my sins because I have heard those words of absolution spoken over me. The bonds have been shattered, and now as a priest in that confessional, I too have that beautiful task to accompany people across that bridge to the green pastures and to shatter those bonds that hold people in bondage. Now, one particular nuance of my own personal mission as a priest has been stirred up by Chesterton, and that is education. Why is education so close to my heart? Someone who's so young, besides the fact that from the age of 5, I've been subjected to the cumbersome system of going to school every September as it comes around and passing through all the exams and making sure everything is in order to continue progressing to the next form. Of course, Chesterton himself wasn't great at progressing. He often sort of did in fits and starts. He didn't move consistently, but it's a striking thing that a young person can have a particular perspective on education because we've newly passed through, we're newly minted in a way. Certainly a great need for humility, but also, speaking about the briar patch of the world and the modern mind, I experienced brokenness in the system of education, profound brokenness, and I see an urgency. John Paul II said, that blessed John Paul II, who will be soon canonized and given to the world in a new way as a great intercessor, a great example and living testimony of faith. He said that every new generation is a new continent waiting to be opened to Christ. Education is one and the same with evangelization. Every new generation born into the world needs to be brought to Christ, brought to faith. And this is what we do through parishes. This is what we do through family life, is opening new continents to Christ. Let us pray that the saints would stir up our zeal, just as missionaries that have gone before were zealous in that task. Let us too be zealous in the work of education. I think it needs to be said as well as I come to a conclusion that some perceive me as very serious. Again, something about being young, often the sense that we should be very lighthearted. I think Chesterton has been very important in my life to remind me of that. Perhaps a certain gravity that I carry, given disposition, given temperament, given, again, the urgency that I've seen, the urgency I've experienced in my own life, seeing a cultural crisis that can't just be allowed to continue to spiral down. I think my seriousness comes from the fact that there are real stakes, and especially as a priest, I recognize that my daily work, humble as it is, as an instrument in the Lord's hands, is a work of life and death, spiritual life, spiritual death. And of course, to work as well in this world, for the poor, for the downtrodden, for those who are suffering, for those who are ignored, for those who are broken, and to allow a fullness of life even in this world, not simply in the life to come. But my experience, and Dale already quoted the line for me, but I'll quote it again, is that the soul of St. Francis expresses something profound that I've experienced. I've received a great deal, perhaps more than my fair share. I've received so much from 2004 to this year, my priesthood ordination last year. I'm filled with gratitude. And Chesterton said about St. Francis that it is the highest and holiest of the paradoxes of man, that he who really knows that he cannot pay his debt will be forever paying it, and he will be giving back what he cannot give back and cannot be expected to give back. He will always be throwing things into a bottomless pit of unfathomable thanks. As a priest, I read this in terms of the Mass, the Eucharistic sacrifice, the prayer of thanksgiving, the offering of God, his only beloved Son. And as Chesterton said in Orthodoxy, real love has always ended in bloodshed. Of course, we'll end this conference with the Mass, the parish Mass. And as I conclude, I want to take those lines from Ronald Knox's translation of the Bible, Psalm 115, certainly very close to me as a priest. But the Lord's mercies have never failed me. What return shall I make to him? I will take the cup that is the pledge of my deliverance and invoke the name of the Lord upon it. I will pay the Lord my vows in the presence of his people. Dearer in the Lord's sight is the death for those who love him. And am I not, Lord, your servant, born of your own handmaid? You have broken the chains that held me bound. I will sacrifice in your honor and call on the name of the Lord. Before a throng of worshipers, I will pay the Lord my vows. And here in the courts of the Lord's house, here in Jerusalem, in your heart, here in Beaconsfield this day, I offer that sacrifice of thanksgiving.